First, I'd like to congratulate the new members. Such an impressive group. And I want to thank your families as well, because I know all of you do that together. And it's amazing, amazing accomplishment. It was such a wonderful opportunity for my wife and I to sit in the audience and listen to the great achievements of each of you. President Liu, distinguished members of the Academy, colleagues and friends, thank you for the honor of addressing you today. As President Liu said, my remarks are about engineering leadership for nation and nature. I want to first start off by thanking my wife, who's in the audience. When my dad was in the Army, he served 26 and a half years, and I thought, how could anyone serve in an organization for that long? And then we served 38. And in 38... In 38 years, I'm sad to say, we lived in 27 different homes. So we moved around quite a bit, and my son was in 9 different schools in his 12 years. But we all made it here and turned out okay. So thank you, Renee. I have a diverse background, and my career has spanned both engineering and in biotech. And I'm going to try to talk about both of them. Here's an engineering castle here in Washington, D.C. I'll talk about it in a minute. But I also want to talk today about biotechnology represented by the double helix. And I've spent about a decade working in that field. And both have been quite interesting, and they overlap in ways that you would find interesting. Now, a bit of trivia of the castle on the left. If you don't recognize it, it's at the Washington Aqueduct. Here in Washington, D.C. President Lincoln's administration oversaw the completion of the Washington Aqueduct, a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project that still supplies drinking water to the nation's capital, including this very building. It was one of many examples where the federal government turned to engineers to meet the needs of a growing and resilient nation. Like others, my journey depended on the help of many. My father enlisted in the U.S. Army, initially served in an all-black unit, met my mother in Japan, and like many military families, my parents did not have the money to send the 5 children to college. So I only applied to 3 schools. I applied to West Point, I applied to the Air Force Academy, and I applied to our local community college in Monterey, California. When I could not obtain a congressional nomination, which is required for appointment to the academies, regardless of your academic, leadership, and athletic qualifications, you must have a congressional nomination, and I couldn't get one. So I assumed my path was set. I would attend Monterey Peninsula Community College and become a carpenter. I've always enjoyed building things. Then retired General George Wall, West Point class of 1917, came to my high school and encouraged me to write the president. I said, why would I write the president if I can't get a congressional nomination? And he explained to me that the president had 100 nominations reserved just for the children of military. So I wrote that letter, and President Nixon gave me a nomination. I did not become a carpenter after all. But years later, I became chief of engineers, and I still enjoy building things. That experience taught me one of the most important lessons of leadership, as President Liu mentioned earlier today, and that's managing talent, opening doors, and believing in people. Those are some of the greatest acts a leader can do for a nation. Sadly, General Wall passed away 3 years after I graduated from West Point. He never saw the full impact of the opportunity that he provided me. As Nelson Henderson is often quoted as saying, the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. General Wall did that for me. When thinking about engineering leadership, particularly for this audience, I think of 2 of our great presidents. As you know, this year we celebrate the 250th birthday of the United States Army, formed on 14 June 1775. Only 2 days later, General Washington named the first chief engineer, Colonel Richard Grigley, marking the birth of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In that long history of leaders serving our country, I was honored to be appointed as the 53rd Chief of Engineers. General Washington realized the importance of engineering to the future of our country. Washington also understood that engineers were more than builders. They were leaders who shaped how a young nation would survive. Leaders, as we heard this morning. During the Revolution, he relied on engineers to conduct fortifications, survey rivers, and design defenses that allowed an outnumbered army to stand up against a world power. That's engineering leadership for nation. As this audience knows very well, a century later, President Lincoln, another wartime leader who made a profound leadership decision, in 1863, he signed a charter creating the National Academy of Sciences. He understood that the survival and progress of our nation required science and engineering advice that was independent and trusted. Again, engineering leadership for nation. The vision of these presidents reminds us that even in turbulent times, the nation has relied on science and engineering to guide difficult choices. Our responsibility is to ensure that this reliance continues, no matter what the circumstances. And sometimes, engineering leadership for nation is not so simple. We need to keep pressing. And I'll talk about some of those not so simple times that I've experienced and that are lessons for all of us. Geography has always shaped America's destiny. Peter Zion wrote a book titled The Accidental Superpower. Part of the book is focused on geography of the United States. The United States is blessed by two vast oceans, east and west, friendly neighbors to the north and south, and perhaps most important of all, the world's most extensive and commercially significant inland waterway system. 12,000 miles of navigable waterways in the Mississippi River Basin, highlighted, as you can see, in green. It's a network that connects our farms, our factories, our cities to the ports in the East Coast, the West Coast, the Gulf, and the Great Lakes. No other nation on earth has an inland waterway system as strategically important as America's. As George Friedman once described, America became what he called the inevitable empire, shaped more by geography than ambition. Our challenge now is to ensure that what geography gave us, the world's most connected waterways and ports, continues to serve both nation and nature responsibly. Our waterways and ports have long served the nation, moving commerce, food, and energy. When designed and managed well, they also serve nature, reducing emissions, restoring ecosystems, and strengthening the natural defenses that make our communities more resilient. Our past provides lessons, but our responsibility today is to anticipate future challenges in infrastructure that will support our nation for the next 100 years. So how have we done? Consider the Mississippi River flood of 1927. The anniversary is just around the corner. It devastated millions of lives, inundated farms and cities, and it reshaped the role of engineers in American society. Out of that disaster came the Flood Control Act of 1928, the largest federal engineering program of its time. It was proof again that in moments of crisis, America turns to engineers, not to rebuild, and not only to rebuild, but to reimagine and to lead. The Great Flood of 2011. Many people don't know about that flood because there were no significant impacts compared to the flood of 1927. In 2011, leadership had to make hard choices to intentionally open floodways to give room for the river to flow. Two key actions were taken: opening Bird's Point, New Madrid floodway, south of St. Louis, and Morganza spillway, shown here, to protect Baton Rouge and New Orleans. The trade-off was flooded farms, towns, and many upset people. These decisions paid off with significantly less flooding and damage. They saved lives. Look at the difference in flooding in 1927 in blue and 2011 in red. The work of our predecessors, starting nearly 100 years ago in creating systems of projects that gave room for the river to expand and to overflow into the floodplains. They were thinking about resilience when resilience wasn't a common term. As mentioned, the Army Corps opened the levee at Bird's Point, New Madrid. A lot of folks think we blew up the levee, but we say we opened up the floodway. We gave access to a floodway that was 5 miles wide and 65 miles long, just to give relief for the Mississippi to flow. The results speak for themselves in reduced acres flooded, damages prevented, and people protected. The lesson applies well beyond the Mississippi River. Rebuilding trust is as important as rebuilding structures. Today and into the future, engineers earn that trust by delivering results transparently, even when the recognition may come many years later. Superstorm Sandy brought another level of engineering leadership and getting things done in a crisis. Mayor Bloomberg asked me to meet with him in New York a couple days after the hurricane struck. This was one of his favorite coffee shops, I learned. And he wanted to know how we were going to work together. And he said, General, tell me how the Corps is going to help the people of New York. And I said, well, sir, you've got a lot of flooding here, and the Corps has a lot of pumps. And he said, well, General, I have a lot of pumps. I don't think I need any help with pumps. I said, okay. What else do you have? I said, we have no electricity, Mayor, and we have a lot of generators. He says, well, I have a generator operating this little place we're in, and I have a lot more generators. I planned for this. So I have a lot of generators. What else do you have? I said, well, Mr. Mayor, you have no idea how much trash you're going to have. After Katrina, we had mattresses thrown out the door. We had couches. You're going to have trash like you've never seen before. He said, General, you obviously don't know how much trash I move in New York City every day. And he said, tell me about your family. I said, my family? He says, yeah, I'd like to know about your family. He says, why do you want to know about my family? And he says, well, I'd like to know about the people I'm working with. And I was thinking, well, we're not going to be working too much together since you don't need anything. And then he finished his coffee and he walked out the door. The gentleman on the far left of him is his chief of staff. And he looked at me, he said, General Bostick, don't move. So he walked Mayor Bloomberg out to his vehicle, and he ran back in. He said, we need everything. We need the generators, we need the pumps, we need the trash, we need it all. And I said, well, what was that all about? He goes, well, he saw Katrina, and you had that 3-star general riding on a horse down there saying people were stuck on stupid. Don't do that in New York City. He said, we got an election coming up, and we're in charge. I said, so the lesson, and it's really important to understand, because science and engineering efforts must operate in a political environment, and all of us need to be sensitive to that environment. In the end, I really enjoyed working with Mayor Bloomberg. He treated us really well. After Superstorm Sandy, in October of 2012, just a few months later, the nation faced another crisis. This was about December of the same year. A severe drought crippled much of the Mississippi River. Barges carrying essential commodities could not pass south of St. Louis because of a stretch known as Pinnacle Rocks. I was in the White House a few months after Sandy, and I saw President Obama in the hallway. He stopped me and said, what are you working on, General? And I said, Mr. President, we're still recovering from Hurricane Sandy. You may not be aware, but 67% of the country is in drought, and barge traffic on the Mississippi is about to stop, and we move $1.7 trillion of commerce along the Mississippi and through our ports. He looked at me and said, General, you need to fix that. I chuckled and looked up to the sky and hoped that we would get rain. You know, a few months later, and I don't normally do this, but somebody told me to watch Jay Leno because the president was going to be on, and he was going to be talking about the economy. And the president mentions how droughts were, was stopping barges, crops weren't moving down the Mississippi, and prices were going up. And Jay Leno looked at him, he said, "So even the rivers are giving you a hard time." But the point was, the president mentioned barges. He mentioned the Mississippi. He remembered. He understood. And again, that's the impact that engineers can have. Helping national leaders see the flow of the river can shape the strength of the nation. Unfortunately, we didn't get any rain. So the White House ordered the Corps of Engineers to release water from the Missouri River dams, to which I said, "That's not possible." And the White House official looked at me and he says, "You don't understand. We're directing you and the Corps to release water from Missouri River dams, and we want that to happen now." And I said, "No, you don't understand. The law does not allow me to release this water. The Missouri dams in their water have multiple purposes, but improving navigation along the Mississippi is not one of them." So while I was standing there, the gentleman I was talking to called Administrator Fugate. He was the FEMA administrator. He says, "We would like you to declare a national emergency so General Bostick could get on with business and release water from the Missouri to help navigation on the Mississippi." And Craig said he couldn't do that because it wasn't a national emergency. The situation did not meet the legal definition of a disaster or emergency under the Stafford Act. Craig Fugate and I are still good friends. We ended up blowing up the Pinnacle Rocks, which are in the middle of the center of the Mississippi, so that the draft of the barges could get through there. It was quite a feat. Rock by rock, we took it out of the Mississippi. But the lesson, again, is we held our ground despite significant pressure and did the right thing for the nation and for nature. That's what makes engineering leadership challenging. Competing priorities, tough trade-offs, and explaining those choices to leaders. Ultimately, engineering leaders must solve these challenges by stewarding a system that serves the nation as a whole. The same was true for Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005, when the levees failed and became a national tragedy, particularly for the Corps of Engineers. Engineers had to rebuild not only the infrastructure, but trust. 7 years later to the day, in August of 2012, and many people don't know this, but there was a hurricane named Isaac, and it made landfall in New Orleans. Most people don't remember Isaac because this system did its job. This is just one of many projects, the Inner Harbor Navigation Channel in New Orleans. It became the first and only project that ever won for the Corps the American Society of Civil Engineering's top award, the Outstanding Civil Engineering Achievement Award. I visited China and met with Minister Chen Li, the Minister of Water Resources. He then visited the United States, and he said he'd like to go to 3 locations. He'd like to go visit New York City and see what we did after Hurricane Sandy. He'd like to see the environmental work we're doing at the Everglades. And he'd like to see the post-Katrina construction in the New Orleans. He came to this site, and he said, General Bostick, congratulations. In China, we could not have accomplished this in 7 years. If you haven't been to New Orleans and seen some of this work, it's the best engineers of this country coming together to do work that is amazing and will stand the test of time. Chen Li looked at me when he was looking at this project. He knows, General Bostick, the flood of 1927, that was a really bad flood for you guys. He said the flood of 1993 was a really bad flood. And the flood of 2011 was a pretty tough flood for you all. Which one was the worst? I said, wow, Minister, most Americans couldn't name those dates and those floods. But, the flood of 1927 was the worst in terms of deaths and damages to crops and farmlands. But the most water to ever come down the Mississippi was 2011. But our system worked. We had a resilient system. I said, Minister, I don't know Chinese history. You obviously know American history on floods. What was your worst flood? And he said, well, in 2000 BC, we had a really bad flood. I said, why's everything got to be bigger and longer and harder in China? But we became really good friends over the years, and he respected all of the great work, and China has done wonderful work in a number of different major construction projects. I've seen how engineering leadership is about transformation, guiding organizations through uncertainty, whether rebuilding trust in New Orleans or helping organizations restructure. Engineers provide the clarity of systems thinking required to make difficult and hard choices. Engineering leadership is not only about responding to today's challenges, but about anticipating tomorrow's. The same systems thinking we apply to water, energy, the infrastructure, now extends to life itself, where biology is becoming the next great engineering frontier. I want to talk about biotech innovations. For me, that lesson carried into biotechnology, where I now spend a significant amount of time. Biotech innovations are shaping our future. Just as AI and advanced modeling are transforming how we design and simulate complex systems, biotechnology is transforming how we address public health. Some of you may wonder how I became involved in biotechnology. Well, the CEO of this biotech company called me and said he'd like me to work for him. And I said, what do you do? And he said, we build better DNA. I said, oh, I build better dams. How could I possibly help your company? And he says, well, we're building an environmental sector, and you're big on the environment. I've heard you talk about the environment, and most of the money in the environment is in the federal government. So would you come and work for us? And I've been in biotech ever since, almost a decade because of that call. Biotech is helping to address some of the world's greatest challenges in energy, food, health, and the environment. AI and advanced modeling are already transforming biology. How engineered mosquitoes, male mosquitoes, can suppress disease. We had a few awardees from Brazil, and the Aedes aegypti mosquito is a huge challenge there. And there's a certain company that has released over 1 billion of these male mosquitoes that they've genetically modified, and they've suppressed over 94% of the wild Aedes aegypti mosquito. We've learned how to turn off enzymes that can cause apples to resist browning, and it reduce waste. 40% of the apples are wasted around the world. Many by little children who bite an apple, bite it again, and then set it down. They don't want to eat it because it's brown. There's a company that's working to change that. How the engineered Atlantic salmon can grow in half the time and a third of the food. And when you think the most expensive part of growing a fish is the food, and you can grow a salmon that takes normally 36 months, you can grow that in 18 months. And a third of the food, that's enormous. But that's also important because the wild Atlantic salmon has declined 70% in recent decades. So companies that are trying to fill this gap through biotechnology. They're also working in agriculture in many ways to help our crops in resisting the weather and resisting pesticides. You heard earlier today helping in COVID, and we've got a great member here that has a big role in that, and it's making a difference in many other areas of health. But it's also helping in infrastructure. This is a group that's working to design airfields and roads, not with concrete, but to use biomaterials that they can grow out of the infrastructure. Imagine that, to take biology and use it responsibly, and to do something that would reduce the amount of carbon that comes from concrete. Now, it's in the very beginnings, all of this is, but it's a path towards the future. AI is becoming a bridge between the digital and the biological, helping engineers partner with nature to create solutions that build, heal, and sustain. Now, this is a busy slide, but I'm going to walk through it. I think it's very important. This is another area of biotech innovation. Now, on this slide, it's a little busy, but if you look at the bottom left and look at that left axis, it's about the frequency of that particular variant of the COVID virus. And it can go all the way, you can see a marker at 50% and another at 70%. But it was first identified, if you look low on the y-axis, it was first identified in wastewater. And this company is trying to create a biothreat radar, where they look in wastewater coming off of a plane, identify the pathogens and viruses that may be on that plane, and then alerting the scientists who can come up with the vaccines. And when you look at the 50% rate, by the time this was 50%, it was another 6 weeks of people walking into the hospital sick. Now, during 9/11, I worked in the National Military Command Center, and we have radar systems that we can track. And if somebody shoots off a radar in North Korea or China or Russia, we can see it in a minute. And we rehearse every day, and we can see a radar system that identifies where that's coming from. We don't have anything like that for pathogens. And as a military person, I think one day it would be very beneficial that rather than waiting until people get sick and walk into a hospital, that you would find a way to track this around the world. And this company happens to be in Boston, and Boston is also where the radar for the big part for America and what we used in World War II, a lot of that research was accomplished there. And just as radar changed the course of war, AI combined with biotechnology can give us the kind of biothreat radar to provide early warning to future pandemics or any types of pathogens that are moving throughout our airports and along with people. Even the best technology will fail us without the next generation using them wisely. That's why I will close by discussing our future, the next generation. I'm honored, deeply honored, to serve on the National Academy's Gulf Research Program, GRP Committee. And as you know, the GRP received funding as a result of the BP oil spill to invest in innovative solutions for the Gulf. And in our view, one of the most important investments we can make is in the young people who will follow those in this room. Before I became the Chief of Engineers, I was the Director of Personnel for the U.S. Army. I was responsible for the programs and policies for over 1 million soldiers and 330,000 civilians. And before that, I led Army Recruiting Command, where we recruited over 180,000 young men and women into the Army each year. Most important for the military, and almost any organization, is talent management and retention of that talent, growing the next generation of leaders. General Wall opened that door for me. Today, we must open doors for young people. The Gulf Scholars of the National Academy Gulf Research Program and other similar programs that many of you are involved in are making a difference. Engineering leadership is not just about what we build, but it's about the people we prepare. The true meaning of engineering leadership is to plant seeds today that will allow the next generation to carry the science and engineering forward, both for nation and nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, General Bostick, for such an enlightening and inspiring lecture. Your call for technical excellence, paired with systems thinking, ethical judgment, and public trust could not be more timely, and we are grateful for your leadership in service to our nation. We will now continue with a moderated conversation, so please join me in welcoming our moderator, Deanne Bell. Deanne is an engineer television host, and the founder and CEO of Future Engineers, an education technology company that runs hands-on design challenges, including NASA's TechRise Student Challenge. Her work has helped name NASA's Perseverance rover and produced the first student-designed 3D print in space. She earned her BS in mechanical engineering from Washington University in St. Louis. Deanne, thank you for guiding the discussion forward.
All right. Do you hear me loud and clear? Is my mic on? We're good? Awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Tom, for that special lecture. It was indeed quite special to hear all of these stories throughout your career. We now are going to go into a moderated Q&A session. So what that means is we have these microphones up here. So I encourage our audience to stand up, go ahead and line up on the microphones, and we're going to be taking your questions from the audience here for Tom. And I'm going to first kick things off. I love all these different touch points you had in your talk. And as I was listening about the infrastructure points that you were making and some of these timelines, you talked about 7 years being remarkably lightning, fast, right? I was thinking about all these layers of collaboration and coordination from the national level to the state level to the local level. And I was just wondering if you want to touch on a little bit about how to build trust throughout all of that complexity when you're working on some of these really large infrastructure projects. How do you, as a leader, build trust and collaboration across all of those different levels?
It's a great question, and thank you, Deanne, for doing this, and it's been a joy to work with you. Building trust is one of the most important things we can do. During Superstorm Sandy, I remember being in auditoriums where the people were in the audience there, and they were so mad. They were so upset. And what really bothered me was that they didn't realize how bad it could get for them. They didn't realize the situation that they were in, whether it was living in a floodplain or not having or not allowing the Corps and others to build the kind of protection systems that would allow them. They were not involved in those decisions. So a big thing is to communicate and to make sure that people understand the situation that they're in. They understand the risk that could happen, particularly in a place like New York City where they don't get hit as often, but they still need to be part of the decision making. So communications is really big. I actually wrote my dissertation on something related to this because I was so shocked and concerned that here at the high level you're working on these strategies, but at the level where it matters, where people live, they're not engaged, they're not involved. So a big part is communicate. And part of that communication is here are the risks. Now, given those risks, there are certain things organizations can do to reduce that risk. And then the other part that's important is you only have so many resources. And those resources can be applied to only so many different areas. So they should be part of that dialogue. And the only way to do that is to have priorities. So it's important to communicate first, collaborate, and then set priorities. And people can look at this and say, now, wait a minute, the section of town that I'm in or the beach that I'm at is not going to receive any federal funding. And they can then engage with their local congressmen, engage with the mayors, and they can be part of the decision-making process. But I think that's a big way to build trust is through communications, setting priorities, and letting folks understand how limited the resources are, and then together, the community deciding how those resources should be applied.
No question in the microphone yet. So to continue on with that, I think anytime we're talking about infrastructure, there's also a public-private potential as well, correct? And obviously with the Corps of Engineers, you're on the public side of it. Can you elaborate a little bit on some times where you've had success in public-private partnerships on some of these infrastructure projects?
Yes, there was one of my goals when I was chief engineer was to find a way to do a public-private partnership on a flood risk management project. Now, we did public-private partnership on energy. So if you think of a dam, hydropower, that power going out, it's easy to monetize that. We had solar arrays that we would put on military bases, and over 30 years, you knew the monetization, how much energy that would provide, how much cost we would pay. But if you're building a levee, trying to monetize that, it's a little bit more difficult. So we decided we were going to do a P3, a public-private partnership. And one of the things I've always felt is if you're looking for guidance and direction, don't come to Washington. Not because because in Washington you don't have your hands on the problem. You're not wrestling with it every day. So I said, let's send a note out to all the communities and say, hey, what's a real challenge that you're working on that we could do a public-private partnership on? In Fargo-Moorhead, they raised their hand and said, we've been trying to get federal money forever. We've got moms and dads, sisters and brothers, grandparents out filling sandbags every year, and we are not in the priority list. So, and we'll never be in the priority of New Orleans or Los Angeles and other areas. So we would like, and we found investors, and we're going to have the community pay extra taxes so that you can do this. So I walked into OMB. I said, hey, this $800 million project, we can save a lot of money, $400 million, because the community is going to pay the other $400 million. So I would like to ring fence this as a private partnership, and it'll be our first one in flood risk management. And he looked at me, he goes, well, I can save everything by not doing the project. And I thought about sales, and people go to sales and they buy a thing on sale, and you save a lot by just not buying it. But that's the way OMB looked at it. But to Ali Zady's credit, he helped me, and we did our first public-private partnership in Fargo-Moorhead, and the Corps is on its 6th public-private partnership.
Wow.
on that type of work.
Wow. Building off of this template you had.
Right.
Phenomenal. We do have a question from the audience. Go ahead and take your question.
General Bostick, first of all, I want to say how grateful and how blessed our nation is that you were able to get your nomination from President Nixon and go on to have all your great accomplishments. So we're very blessed as a country, so thank you. General, when you went to your biotechnology slide, you had a photo of a crop with the double helix next to it and mentioned, we're going to have crops that can deal with the extreme weather changes that we're having in our country, but there's certainly a stigma with genetically modified plants. And how do you address that? Because it's something that a lot of people are afraid of.
Great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. People are, it's interesting, when it comes to cancer, people are okay. And they're okay with a biotech solution that might save them from dying. So the risk is really high, but they're willing to take that risk because their alternatives are not that good. We're not there yet with food, but we're going to get there. In 2050, we're going to have 2 billion more people on the planet. Our protein requirements are going to be huge, and we can't wait until we get to that point. So I think part of it is to help the people of today understand why the science is important and to pursue that science as quickly as we can. It's a tougher challenge on something you're going to put in your mouth. Even though cancers are going to be put in your blood, some of these therapies, it's okay because the risk is so high. So I think part of it is going to take time, but I think the other part of it is education. That salmon we were talking about, they were selling it in Canada for a long time, but it took a long time to get through the U.S. I remember working on this, and I know when everyone was looking at efficiencies in government, I was kind of pulling my hair out because I said, I know some efficiencies. That salmon that I showed you, You know how long it took to get through FDA? 22 years. 22 years to get through FDA. The mosquito took 8 years, 5 years in FDA and then 3 years in EPA. So part of what I'll say is the regulatory system is going to make darn sure that it's healthy and okay for human consumption. The reality was in year one that salmon was healthy for human consumption according to the scientists, but for political reasons we couldn't get it through until after 22 years. So I think regulatory is going to help. Desperation is going to help. Education and communication with folks will help as well. And there are going to be countries that are going to need it more than others. Like this mosquito, Brazil needed this. That they needed that solution more than we needed it in the U.S. Governor Scott called me on my cell phone when he was the governor of Florida, when they had the problem with Aedes aegypti there and the babies with the small heads. And he asked me to release the mosquitoes there, but we didn't have regulatory authority. We couldn't do it. So I think there's going to be a combination of regulatory, people that really are demanding a solution when there's a gap in some sort of food. And we're seeing it in some places in Africa and other places where crops, corn, are being decimated. So we've got to find some solutions.
And I'm going to go to this question in a second, but I'm going to follow on that because you talked about the 22-year approval process, I believe is the number you used. But then we also talked about the 7-year accomplishment of building that infrastructure. So in your line of work, what are some of the, is it solely demand, like you mentioned, that's expediting some of these processes of approvals? What are some of the strategies? Do you think it's relationship building that's helping to expedite some of these things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Hurricane Betsy hit the New Orleans coast in 1965. 40 years later, Hurricane Katrina hit. And the Corps had a lot of problems with some of the things we built down there, but in 40 years, the work we were told to do after Hurricane Betsy, we're about 50% complete. 50% complete. And the way things work is, back to resources, I used to live in California, and my good friend Senator Feinstein, she's not going to vote for something in New Orleans. She's got issues that we're not finding in California. And I'm not picking on California, but it's until there's a crisis of enormous magnitude, the country is not going to be able to devote those resources, because it's like peanut butter. And the Corps' got 3,000 projects a day. We're spreading it like peanut butter and trying to get enough projects done as we can with the money that we have. So in times of war, in times of disaster, in times of pandemics, you'll see the country come together and set the priorities I was talking about. If you think about Hurricane Katrina, I mean, it was like $135 billion that the country invested in post-Katrina. 14 billion came to the Corps. And in 7 years, with 14 billion, we built a system that we could have built in 1965. Maybe some of the technology wasn't there, but we could have done it short of priorities. And that's why I think one of the biggest things the folks in Washington, where I spent a good part of my time, is to help with setting priorities for the nation. In times of peace, what are those priorities that we should be working on? And I've seen it happen successfully. Senator Feinstein, Senator Lamar Alexander set priorities along the Mississippi. And they said, we're going to do Olmsted Lock and Dam first. And then we're going to go to the Chick locks. And they went right down the priority list. Because I remember testifying once, and the head of the committee said, General Bostick, the Corps of Engineers is really slow. I said, yes, we are. We're very slow. Oh, you agree with me? I said, I agree. We're slow. And he goes, well, why are you so slow? And I said, money. lack of priorities. And I said, it's like building a house. The way we do it in the government is we tell the contractor to come in and build the the basement, okay? And once you have the basement foundation in, leave for about 2 years. And then I'll call you back and I have enough money saved up and build the first floor. But when you're building the first floor, just do the kitchen. That's all I have money for. Then come back in another 3 years. Don't you think that's expensive? Isn't that slow? And they said, well, how much money do you need to fix everything that we've told you to work on? The projects you're working on now, how much do you need? I said, I need $23 billion. How much did we give you? 1.5? I said, do the math. We're real slow. 15, 16 years, I'll be done. And so that's when I came back and I said, we're not going to get all this money. We have to do public-private partnerships. And that's how we started that public-private partnership. So the government's got to figure it out. And the government doesn't have a lot of money. So the government's got to work with the locals got to work with federal and state. We've got to work together to prioritize and take what limited funds we have on the top priorities. In those other areas, we have high risk. And everybody knows it. And you can stay in those areas of high risk or you can leave. And nobody wants to leave.
We have a question here. Let's go to this
Thank
question.
you. Mark Bartow, Texas A&M. I really appreciated your comments about preparation and also making tough decisions. And I wanted to delve a little deeper into the latter and use a couple of words that are out of favor this year: environmental justice. And, after Katrina and Rita, there was a lot of criticism of certain communities that had been sort of left unprotected. And I think part of the response that produced the infrastructure since then addressed some of that. I'm a native of Missouri, and I happen to know that New Madrid and the Boot Heel are some of the most impoverished parts of the state, and a lot of the population on public assistance. And I have little doubt that when you flood that part of the state from a purely economic loss optimization point of view, that makes sense. I'm wondering how you bring in the impact on people and the socioeconomic impacts and the fairness to different communities in making these hard decisions.
It's a great question and a great point, and thank you for making it. I was on another National Academies commission that looked at what they called urban flooding and looked at flooding across the United States. And most of the flooding that we have is not from the Katrinas and the Sandys. It's what they call nuisance flooding. It's flooding that's happening all the time. And it happens mostly in impoverished areas, folks that are older, folks that are economically challenged, ethnically, different ethnic groups are impacted. Some of our real estate folks are putting people in those areas and they're not knowing, and then they're stuck. So we found a lot from that. But one of the things that struck me is going back to this need for communications and the need to get stakeholders involved. The places we had the most difficult time getting stakeholders involved are often the places that need the help the most. I mean, if you go to the 9th Ward in New Orleans, it's still massive devastation. And we would go to New Orleans and other areas of the country that really needed help, parts of Chicago and Baltimore. In the areas that really needed help, we need help encouraging those people that live in those areas that are most at risk to be part of the debate, to come to the meetings, to pound on the tables and say, we want help. Because that's how the priorities get set. And if there are silent voices, then it's going to take others. And we're part of that. We know who needs help, but we also need the community. So if you live in a community where you know that people are impoverished, and bring them along and have their voices heard so that the community can listen to them and they're part of setting the priorities. But it's a huge, huge challenge.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll go to this question here.
So I'm Glenn Diger from the University of Michigan. General Bostick, I'm a water person like you. So, but I want to talk about infrastructure. but not just water infrastructure, but infrastructure more broadly. Yeah, we're slow to build things. We are horrible at maintaining things. All you have to do is look at the scorecards and so forth. So different sections of infrastructure. If you get a C, that's a high grade. So, and when we do something, we tend to rebuild it in the old way. We make a mistake that we tend to fix it up in the old way, whereas in so many areas we have new things. What can we as engineers do to turn that equation around? Because there's a risk in terms of not addressing it. There's a loss of opportunity, but there is an opportunity in bringing the new approaches to infrastructure in place much more quickly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. It's an excellent point, and it would frustrate the Corps and many leaders that were involved in some of these reconstruction efforts, because often we would have to reconstruct to the standard of where they were before. That was part of it. The other part that was challenging, trying to get through the engineering and design process and working with communities to get a project on the table that you could build takes years. And you have to balance that with members that are pushing to do things in communities right away, to very quickly get communities back on your feet. And all you have are the plans that you've designed from before. The engineering design process, like I said, is years working through the communities and with the Congress to get it funded and approved. We've learned a lot from disasters. This picture that I showed you in New Orleans, and we've got a pumping station down there. It will pump the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It'll pump that out in 3 seconds. There's nothing in the world like it. I mean, this country can build things that are of a standard that no one can touch, and we're capable. Engineers like you and others are capable of doing that. And in times of crisis, we've been able to do that. And what we have to do is, in peacetime, find a way to do that same sort of rapid redevelopment, reconstruction. And I think it's hard. I think we have to work together with the local community, all the way up through the state and with the federal government to push the government to change. But I have seen some positive changes where they allowed us to build to a new standard and to redesign instead of using what was there before. We did some of that after Sandy. We certainly did it after Katrina.
Thank you.
We'll go over here for our next question.
Yes, hi, my name is Chuck. Thank you, General, for your insights about leadership. I have affiliation actually with University of California, Berkeley. My question is that, you kind of alluded to earlier about leadership, and especially how change leadership, and how sometimes it takes forever to make things happen. I'm also particularly concerned about right now in the age of technology, and certainly in the age of AI. A lot of things are, really accelerating. And so my question to you is, given your leadership and what you've done in large organizations, what strategies do you recommend for transforming, large or small bureaucracies into really more agile, innovative ways of doing things? And certainly part of that is there's concerns about age of AI where there's mass layoffs or unemployments and situations of such.
Yeah, I think we can broaden that up to how do we take something that might be a slow, long process and bring in emerging technologies, bring in accelerating technologies? How do those things reconcile? How do those things collaborate and work together?
Yeah, it's a great question, and many are trying to do that. I think from the military perspective, they started this Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, where they're trying to bring people from Silicon Valley and experience from all across the country and across the world that can help the Department of Defense accelerate the innovations that it needs. And we can do this. We've done it before. And unfortunately, it normally happens in crisis. But I think about when I deployed into Iraq, we had plastic doors on our vehicles, and on the first day in Iraq, we had 8 killed and 52 wounded in my unit. It got worse from there. And the country mobilized and gave us vehicles that protected our soldiers in less than a year. Our industry can do this, but our acquisition system is really antiquated and old. So we have to find a way, and a lot of that is regulatory, a lot of it is congressional driven, policy driven. So you know, we've taken advantage of these crises to show that we can move quickly, we can build things in 7 years, we can build protective systems that keep soldiers alive in less than a year, and we have to continue to push on that. And I think, you know, the beauty of what I've seen between government and biotech, it was such a drastic transition for me. I mean, it was like, I got that call from the CEO. The next day, his office called and said, we'd like you to help us out on a project. And I said, what's that? He says, well, we got these mosquitoes. And I said, I'm sorry, I know nothing about mosquitoes. He said, no, we've already genetically engineered them. They're in Brazil. The scientists are in Oxford. And we would like, he says, Dr. Fauci said, we can't scale this. So we'd like the chief engineers to help us scale it. So what do you need me to do? We'd like you to look at the factory we've built. And I said, okay, you know, can you build many factories, the supply chain and all of that? And I said, yeah, I can do that. He says, great, can you leave tomorrow? I said, leave for where tomorrow? Can you go to Brazil tomorrow? I said, wait a minute, I have no job, but I have a life. I'm not going anywhere. I didn't even know I needed a visa to go to Brazil. I mean, the speed that they move, I mean, in technology is like, it's something very foreign to government, but we're trying to bring those two together, and I think that's one thing that we have to do. And you have to bring change agents in. The military, we're a very structured organization, very hierarchical, but we have change agents, and we bring them in, and they help to change dramatically the way that we've done things. And I've tried to do that myself, but I think that's a big part of it. And it can help, and it is making a difference.
Thank you.
We'll take a question over here now.
Yes, and Deanna, this may be a question for you as much as it is for the general, and that is, there's an elephant in the room. We at the academies represent the forefront of engineering understanding. Medicine and science are the same way in their academies. Public confidence in that is at an all-time low. The elephant in the room is, what do we do so we make sure public policy is set by people who understand the ramifications of our decisions and make intelligent and thoughtful decisions for the longer future? I call on that because I watch public policy constantly, virtually every day, making decisions that seem to be wrong-headed, and I wonder if you can help me understand that I'm wrong. I would love to know that.
I think in general, we're going to take that question as, I guess, in your mind, what are some of the different strategies to engage the public? We talked about building trust earlier, right? But I think broader, it's more this communication piece, this awareness piece, this education piece. And what are some of the success tactics you've had in your line of work with communication, education, and empowerment, I guess, through policy in his question, but just in general, communication and education?
Well, I think first I'd say be part of the solution. You know, get in the room wherever you can and be part of the solution to help change things in policy and programs with your local congressman and engage. And that's a big part of it. And then I think it's building alliances. You cannot do it by yourself. You need a group of stakeholders that are pounding on the desk saying, we want to change this, and we want to do things differently. The example I gave you of Fargo-Moorhead, I mean, they'd still be here today if we didn't decide, filling sandbags, if they didn't decide they had enough, and they knew they were never going to get funding, and they came up with an innovative solution that involved venture capitalists and private equity money and tax monies. They came up with the solution. So I think a big part of what I would say is be an advocate, go visit your congressman, talk to them, explain the solutions that you think will work. Most in Washington are, I always say you're focused on 3 different things, and it's elections, it's the budget, and what's ever in the media. And you're trying to tamp down those and work within that. And then in between, you're trying to run your organization and trying to do well at it. But some of the best ideas I have found come from outside of Washington. They come from people that are wrestling with an issue, and they need help, they need a decision, and they need support from the federal government, and you've got to find a way to do that. And you all are experts in your area, and I would say when, I go up to Wall Street sometimes, and I was there last week, and I talked to groups, and people are frustrated, and I said, well, when's the last time you volunteered to do something and come down? You don't have to move to Washington, but serve on a National Academy program that might need people that understand money. Volunteer to do some of the commission work. And some have, but I think we all have to be part of the solution. I was on the National Commission that renamed the Confederate name bases. I had told my wife I wasn't going to volunteer for anything else, and Senator Jack Reed called me on a Sunday morning at 10 o'clock in the morning. He said, hey, General, how you doing? How's your family? I said, great. He says, I need your help. And he said, you need my help? And he says, yeah, we've got this commission to rename the Confederate name bases. I get to put one name on it. I'd like it to be you. So my wife was still, resting or in our gym. I said yes, and then went back and told her. So I spent 20 months working on that. But I, so, and I know things have changed there, but still, I think get into the process, help change things when you have an opportunity.
And I'll just say in my line of work, I couldn't agree more about the get out there, be present, be involved. In the work that I do with engineering education or in communication, it's just, if you expect people to come to you to seek out advice, then you're kind of thinking the opposite way. You have to go to where people are. And so I think when it comes to us being experts in our fields, it's a lot about us finding out ways to plug in, right? Plug in, use those communication skills. The only reason I'm a TV host is because I happen to live in LA working in the aerospace industry. And I went to an audition and they were like, oh, we didn't know that you existed. And I was like, well, that's a disservice to our world if we don't have engineers on TV, if we're hiring actors to play engineers, right? And in my mind, I thought, I'm not qualified to do this. Like, I have no I didn't even do acting. Like, I couldn't ever do this. And then I thought, who is? Right? I think all of us as engineers realizing that we're qualified in so much more than just our technical discipline. We're qualified in levels of communication, qualified in levels of engagement and education, and we can use all of those skill sets to, I think, engage in a broader capacity. I know you talked about your role in recruitment in the military and how that skill set has been so powerful in your trajectory, in your career. And I think some of these skills like leadership and just interpersonal connections really can benefit all of us in the technical sector.
Yeah, and I think, if you don't get called on, then look for opportunities. I just finished that commission on renaming, and I got a call from the Secretary of the Army and the Chief Staff of the Army. This was 2 years ago, and they said, we're having a recruiting problem. I said, I noticed. And they said, you commanded recruiting command. I said, I did. He said, we could use your help. And I said, well, there's a lot of generals that commanded recruiting command, and I just finished this other commission. Why don't you get somebody else? And he said, well, you can't change recruiting command unless you know the personnel system of the Army. You've led both. I said, there's one other general that's led both, and I haven't seen him volunteer for anything. And then she looked at me and says, you're a change agent. Just buttered me up and says, we need your help, please. So I did it. I went on and we changed the strategy of recruiting. But it was good that the Army recognized that they needed to reshape the whole way that they recruit and market and grow talent in the recruiting world. And in recruiting, one of the great lessons I learned was marketing and advertising. No other part of our Army did we train people in how to do marketing and advertising. And we did NASCAR, NHRA, professional bull riding. We're in all the high schools and colleges. So we're growing people with these kinds of skills, and then engagement with colleges and universities and high schools, and teaching soldiers that have just come out of combat this how to do this. So it was important that we reframe how we did that, and we did. It took us about 6 months to change the strategy of that organization. And I tried to do the Heisman, and I just encourage you, whenever you have the opportunity, to help either the academies or help in Washington. And I'd say, go visit your congressman. I was a White House fellow, and I decided, young captain, I'm going to go visit my congressman. I looked him up, and his name was Leon Panetta from Monterey. So knocked on the door. Hey, Mr. Leon, and they were getting ready to close down Fort Ord. And he called me one day, and he says, come to my office. And he said, hey, they're going to close Fort Ord in this base closing, and I'd like your help. And then I said, I'm just a little major, sir. I can't help you. He goes, but you're a White House fellow. You're smart. I said, but I'm a major. I can't help you. And he goes, sit down, shut up, and let's come up with a game plan. And years later, he's the SecDef, and we're both working through Hurricane Sandy. But I think the relationships that you build in Washington, even from one-time engagements, go visit the people that represent your community. They're the ones that are going to help with policy and programs. Visit the members in DOD, or whatever department or agency you're in. Sometimes they're hard to get to. Right now they're really hard to get to with the government being closed. But go out and visit and talk to them and give them your ideas. Because I'll tell you, a lot of them, when you're in Washington, you don't hear from the local public enough.
Okay, we have time for, I think, a couple more questions. Right here, yes.
General, thank you so much for the inspiring story. One of the things I like very much is how you walked us through your career and the opportunity you had to become who you are today. It appears that that's still happening today. If you're in a fortunate situation where you are just selecting the selected, the smart ones get in, or you are fortunate to be in a place where somebody identified you as a potential person to take an opportunity. But you also looked at the way you solve problems from engineering perspective. And we are still using the old model to identify talents today, because you touched on how we can train the next generation to take over and solve the problems ahead. So given the problem of challenges with inclusiveness that we have today, how to bring people from different backgrounds to solve problems because they can look at it from different areas, how can you share with us your experience on the best way to go out and look for these talents that may not be on the table today?
Great. I think, so we're going to answer this one pretty quick, and we'll get to this one as well. But I'm going to summarize that with how do you incorporate inclusiveness in the work that you do? Is that okay?
Yeah. I think at first I'd say start in elementary school. My wife was a principal of an elementary school here in Virginia, Fairfax. It had 40 different countries represented, 22 different languages, and every faculty member had to speak a foreign language and be fluent in it. And I would go in and I'd teach engineering and leadership 4 times a year or so. And I was just amazed at the young people. And they're all in college or graduated from college and are doing great things. And some of them, Renee got a note on LinkedIn that's a mechanical engineer. And I don't know if he did that because of one of those classes, or I don't know if he was in one of those classes, but I think start early is what I would say. And then develop that talent. If you're in business, where I'm at now, you're going to see people that are very young that are very talented. And being young doesn't mean you can't run an organization. There are very young, smart, talented people that are running organizations, and I think it's a leader's job to identify that talent.
Great stuff. I don't actually know if we have time unless it's super quick. Is it a super quick one? But you know what?
The question is very quick.
Okay.
First of all, thank you so much for your service. I know how difficult it is. If you don't mind, I'm gonna ask a little bit of a personal question. Feel free to answer it anyway. Were you afraid of losing your job when you stood up to President Obama?
Oh, I was about to be fired multiple times, but it wasn't because of President Obama. I mean, Governor Cuomo called the White House several times and asked that they fire me. He put it in writing that they fired me, you know, and there was all sorts of reasons. But, you know, life's difficult when you're in the political military arena. But I'm here. You know, I never got fired.
You're here, and your words resonated so much. Thank you so much for sharing your talk today, your thoughts on engineering leadership for nature and nation and nature.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, General Tom Bostick. Thank you so much, everyone, for your insightful questions, and we will be taking a break now. All right, sounds good. Thank you so much.